Hey, and welcome to Office Hours Audio University. If you're new here, I'm Kyle. If you're not new here, welcome back. While we start this stream, we're just going to give people a few minutes to sign on, but that gives you a good opportunity if you're already watching to leave a comment below the video. Just be sure I'm flying solo here, so it's kind of hard for me to read comments and keep the stream going at the same time. So if you've got any questions, please type 3 question marks before your question in a comment below the video, and that'll help me easily scan and see what's a comment and what's just conversation between viewers. And if you don't have any comments or if you don't have any questions, something that was really cool that one of my professors did in college, Professor Hufker, would say at the beginning of class, "Tell me an audio thing," because sometimes it helps to explain something in a way to help yourself learn it a little bit more. That's why I have a YouTube channel. I'm one of those people who, when I explain something, it helps me learn it better. So I make videos where I explain these things, and in the process of doing so, I learn the things even better than I did before. And I want to give you an opportunity to share something that's audio related that you think is interesting. So please leave that below or leave a question, and I'll be happy to get to as many questions as I can. We have a few questions, though, that came in from our Audio University members, so we're going to get started with those. If you're not an Audio University member, you can find a link below the video to enroll at Audio University. That gives you access to our full course library. It gives you access to events with guests and with real audio professors who are professionals and professional instructors. So it's the Audio University that you've come to love, hopefully. Thorough videos that are explained in a really structured way that's easy to understand. So if you want to join as a member, please check out the link below. And if you aren't interested in becoming a member, but you do want access to the free resource library, you can also find a link below for that. That includes our guides, like the ear training guide, the instrument frequency guide, and all those things that you hear me mentioning, all in one place. Mac has joined on here. He says hello. And actually, Mac, we're going to get to your question right away here. So Mac's a longtime founding member, and I appreciate you, Mac, in your pursuit to find the best bass sounds that exist. Mac says, I did some research while shopping for a bass, and I want to talk about the P bass sound versus the active bass sound. So the P bass, the precision bass from Fender, it has passive pickups, and he wants to compare that to an active bass sound with an active preamp as a part of the bass. Those will usually require like a 9-volt battery or something like that. The way Max says it, though, he says the P bass sound limited frequency range versus the active bass sound full frequency spectrum. And you also wanted to discuss how countless session players use the P bass because of how it sounds and how we're used to how it sounds. That's a really interesting thing that I would love to talk about. You also go on to say it's a remarkable juxtaposition you find yourself in because your ears totally love the P bass, and at the same time, your heart wants to play something so much more. I'm interested to hear more about what you mean by that, Mac. If you want to leave a comment to help me understand what you mean by more. But I know that this is the bass that Mac ended up going with, and I think it is. I just quickly looked this up, but he says that he went with the Stingray 5, and yeah, I think active versus passive pickups. That's an interesting topic, and I think it applies to even wider topics that are not just bass related. So, I mean, I like the way you put that. That a lot of session players use a P bass just because we're used to how it sounds, and I think that's an interesting concept. It kind of reminds me of the analog versus digital debate. What sounds better is an impossible question to answer. I've done a lot of research, and I like to use the word fidelity. Which one is higher fidelity, digital or analog? And in my research, it's pretty clear that digital is the highest fidelity option available, but analog still sounds better to a lot of people. And I think that some of that has to do with what we're used to. So maybe sometimes we're used to a more harmonically rich sound of analog compared to the more sterile and transparent sound of digital. So getting that back to the P bass and the active bass, I would hesitate to say that one is better than the other. For me, I feel like it's just like it's just another tool that you have available to you. So if we look at the P bass and the active pickup bass, you will often hear like a difference in sound where the P bass sounds, maybe a little bit less detailed than an active bass. An active bass might sound a little bit brighter or have a bit of shimmer or transient detail that the P bass doesn't have. Mac goes on to say, let's see this real quick. He says, well, the P bass is just so categorically classic and relatable and honest, and that because it doesn't sparkle or ring or all of that. Yeah, I see what you mean. And it actually sits more easily in a mix. I'm glad you like your bass, by the way. And I think this is an important point you're making here, Mac. It's like, what will sit in the mix? Especially if we have conceptualized rock, for example, rock instrumentation around a classic passive pickup bass. A lot of the work might be done for you by the passive bass. It may be the fact that you can still get that sound even with an active bass, because one characteristic of an active bass is that you often have more control over the sound with the knobs, as opposed to just a passive tone knob that you might find on a passive instrument. But I think this is an interesting detail you've shared here as well. You say that it also depends on if I'm playing deathcore or folk singer-songwriter. Yeah, absolutely. And if you're playing both of those things, maybe an active bass is the right choice for you. I mean, you've already gone with the active bass. And I think for you, knowing you, Mac, that's a good thing, because it's going to give you the opportunity to explore potentially a wider palette than you would have had access to with a P bass. That's another thing with analog and digital, though. I keep bringing it back to this. Like, you could probably theoretically get an analog sound with digital tools. Many companies have done that. But if you tried to do it with just EQ and with compressors and the standard tools in a digital world, it would take you a lot of tweaking to get the exact analog sound, whereas an analog piece of gear automatically does that. So it's almost like an easy button to that goal. And I think that a P bass is an easy way to get the P bass sound. And you could potentially turn the knobs and use processing on an active bass to get the P bass sound as well. It just might take you a little bit more work. Obviously, it would take you more work because the P bass sounds like a P bass right out of the gate, whereas the active bass has just a lot more versatility. And then you said also something in your comment was, let me read this again. It says, my ears totally love the P bass sound in nearly every mix you hear it in, but your heart wants something so much more. If your ears say it sounds good, that's really, I mean, I don't know. I see what you mean as a creative person. You might want to, your heart, maybe that's what you're talking about. As a creative person, you want the ability to go outside of the confines of that classic sound. So I don't know. I would say at the end of the day, trust your ears, because one thing I don't want you to think is that in any case, not just P bass versus active bass, but in any case, microphones, converters, all these things, I don't want you to think that just because something has a wider frequency range, that it's necessarily better. Again, to the beginning of my answer, better is entirely subjective. Fidelity is maybe a better word. It has a wider frequency range. So an active bass versus a passive bass, probably active pickups do have higher fidelity. So what goes into them is what comes out, more so than a passive pickup. But does that really matter? Because if we've come to learn what a bass sounds like as the P bass, then it's I don't know. It's not necessarily better or worse. Like I said with analog, running something through and getting some distortion, that's not necessarily bad. That can actually be better in some cases. And I like where you're going with the active bass. I think you made a good decision. I told you, Mac, that my friend Josh and I always used to go to guitars. I mean, when I say always, we went to Guitar Center like twice a week in high school, and we sometimes bought stuff, but mostly we just played stuff. And one that we saw was this Music Man bass that had, the active pickup, and it was deep blue colored. And I mean, Josh, if Josh is watching, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's become a legend. So I'm glad that Mac, you're able to play that sort of bass. Let me read this other comment you left here about this topic. It says, that's what made the decision actually tricky. Like, I totally respect the P bass, but when I say I want more, I just really like that Justin Chancellor sound. I don't know who that is, but if he uses an active bass, maybe you're now equipped with the tools to get that sound. And I think that at the end of the day, just like in our membership, Mac, like, that's what we always try to do. Is better is a word that the longer you go into the rabbit hole that is audio engineering, the less you tend to use it, because then you start to think, what is my intention here? What's my goal? And what tools do I need to get there? So, and I know that you've been a really good example in our membership, always trying new things and always being an active member. So thank you for joining and leaving that question ahead of time. I saw that Arco is also here. He's another member. Hey, Arco, if you're still here, let me know. I wanted to answer your question that you left, and you've mentioned this before, and so maybe we didn't give you as good of an answer as we could have. So I'm going to answer your question here in office hours, which is just me. But then, because you remember, next month we're going to have an Ask a Professor session, and I'll try to get Gabe's opinion on this as well, so that you can get a more well-rounded answer. But your question had to do with HRTFs and binaural mics. So here's a binaural mic. It's got pinna on the sides that simulate generic ears. It's got spacing here that it's kind of roughly the size of my head, roughly the size of your head, but maybe not exact. And the idea is that this mic not only will hear level differences between sounds depending on where they come from. If it's over here, it'll be louder in the right ear than it is in the left ear, because it takes a further path to the left ear. In that further path, it also arrives at the right ear sooner than reaching the left ear. So that's a time difference. So you have level difference, time difference, but then you also have the pinna here, the outer ear, and that can result in what's called a head-related transfer function, or HRTF. And Arco's question has to do with, well, all of our ears and heads are different. So if I place a binaural head mic, even if it's better than this, like the Neumann KU100, it's got a full head. If I place that and record something, your question, Arco, was, when I play it back, won't that, first of all, not be exactly like my HRTF? And yes, that's a true intuition, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But then you said also, second, won't that HRTF filter that's already been captured through the recording go through another filter that is my actual HRTF while I listen to it? So in other words, if you record it with a head mic and then you play it back and you're listening with a head, then it's kind of going through two HRTFs. I think that was your question. And let's talk about the first thing, HRTF. Generic HRTFs are a really popular topic right now with all this immersive stuff going on. And I find it helpful to think of a generic HRTF as kind of like a binaural mic. I interviewed the guy who did some research on the Neumann KU80, I think is what it was called. It was the predecessor to the KU100. Let me pull up a KU100 here so that everybody can understand what we're talking about. In my recent searches, I'm constantly looking up this thing. Okay, so this is the Neumann KU100, and it's basically got two XLR outputs. One is for the left ear and one is for the right ear. There are little microphones inside of these ears. And the idea is that it can capture the interaural level differences, the interaural time differences, and also the HRTF, the head-related transfer function. In other words, what happens to the sound spectrally when a head is involved. These ears, at least the ones on the KU80, they were based on one of the guys who was doing the research. It wasn't the guy I talked to, Stefan Poyce, but it was just another person on the research team. They did some research and they said, oh, this guy has pretty generic ears. So they molded his ears and applied them to the KU80. I'm not sure what's actually on the KU100. But I think in general, when they're designing these mics, they try to take an aggregate. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's basically the average, I would assume, of all people's ears. And in doing that, hopefully the spatial effect that they have on recordings will translate to more people. And to take that a step further, I'm pretty sure Neumann's Rhyme plugin that is a virtual monitoring, it allows you to listen to virtual monitors in headphones. I think the way they did that was they took a KU100 and they put it in a studio, and then they fired sounds at it from different angles. And that in that way, the generic HRTF that you use in Rhyme is the KU100, and it will either work for you or it won't, or it kind of will and kind of won't. In Rhyme, you can go in there and you can change the spacing, which is kind of interesting. So if this is a little bit more narrow than my ears, I might benefit from changing the spacing in Rhyme in that plugin to be wider, and then maybe those spatial cues will translate better to me. And then there are also some other solutions coming out from Sony and SonarWorks and different companies that they put microphones in your ears, not in a dummy head, but in your ears, and then you test in a speaker environment. You record the difference between the sound, I guess, picked up probably from the measurement microphone versus the sound picked up by the microphone in your ear. And that creates a delta or a difference between what sound sounds like just in the room versus what it sounds like in the room in your ears. So we're trying to isolate these different things, right? It's an interesting place that the industry's in right now, because we're not really sure how to do that on a wide scale. So SonarWorks has a solution that you can get and measure your own room, and that's pretty cool. You may or may not have a nice room, though. And so do you really want to capture your room, or would you rather go to someone else's room and capture your head in that room? That's more similar to what Sony is doing with their VME, their virtual mix environment. I've had that done in like trade show booths, but again, I don't really want to mix in a trade show booth. So in order for that to be useful for me, I would ideally go to like their studio in Tokyo or their studio in California and have them record or measure the HRTF of my actual head in that really good room. Because when you measure an HRTF, it's sort of inextricably linked currently from the room if you do it through that method. Another method that I've seen people doing, like Dolby for a while, had this camera feature where it would look at the topography of your ear and use some algorithm, I guess, to figure out what that would translate to into an HRTF profile. And if this is all just really confusing, I mean, it is kind of a confusing topic. So I hate to just keep rambling about this, but I think it's helpful to think of an HRTF as a map of EQ curves, depending on where sound is. So let's say a sound right here has, let's just say it has a flat frequency response for the sake of comparison. And then I move it over here, and in this ear, it's a little bit of a shadow acoustically. So maybe there's some bit of a high frequency roll off, and maybe there are some resonances that occur. And so if you look at these HRTF measurements, often they have huge dips in them. It's not just really subtle stuff. But then over time, you learn, Arco, to hear your own HRTF and to you have adapted over your entire life. I've adapted over my entire life listening to my ears. So you're absolutely right to think, does a generic HRTF work for everyone? No, it does not. Okay. So that was part one. Part two is going to be a little bit shorter. Part two was when I listen to an HRTF filtered recording, won't it be then going through my HRTF again as I listen to it? And yeah, but typically you would only listen to a binaural recording in headphones. Now, the Neumann engineer told me that they can translate to speakers, but I feel like in modern terms with Dolby Atmos, binaural renderings, or other binaural renderings from object-based mixing, I think you should only listen to binaural in headphones. And in that way, now you're kind of bypassing the HRTF that exists because the speakers are right here. And so the HRTF isn't the effect of your pinna in headphones is, I think, almost negligible compared to what it is if you're listening on speakers. So to answer your question, Arco, yes, HRTFs, yes, generic HRTFs will not maybe work for everybody. And there are ways that they're trying to get custom HRTFs at scale. And then part two, you should always listen to binaural recordings in headphones. And that way you're only hearing the HRTF that was applied to the recording through the mic or through the renderer, not the HRTF of your physical body as you listen. Okay. Good question. One of my favorite topics, but it is a convoluted topic. So I hope that I didn't lose anybody there. All right. Let's get to another question here. Remember, leave question marks before your questions if you're going to leave one. This is a question. I'll bring it up. What's your opinion on audio and light engineers, music producers, and DJs? I don't know what you mean there, but I think that all of those things are related. So if you can do a little bit of each of those things, you'll be better at any one of them, including lighting, especially if you work in live sound. Okay, here's a really cool question. What exactly is a DI box's job? Sorry, I'm new to audio. No need to be sorry for just being new. I was new once too. And I didn't even say sorry when I was new. Okay, so what is a DI box's job? A DI box's job, there could be several, but one primary reason you use a DI box is that your instrument is a high impedance circuit, and your mic input on your mixer or on your interface or your preamp is a low impedance input. So if you were to connect a high impedance input to the low impedance input, it would impact the frequency balance in the way that the circuit worked together as a whole. So what a DI box does is it has a high impedance input, and then it has a transformer inside that is not physically connected like with a hard connection, but it does allow sound from one side of the transmitter to be inducted, let's say wirelessly, onto the other side, which it connects to the low impedance circuit of your mic input. So to say that in a much simpler way, a DI box allows you to connect an instrument or any high impedance source to a low impedance destination. The most common way you'd find that would be on a stage, connecting an instrument like a passive guitar or an active guitar or something else that has high impedance like a phone output, and connecting that into a mixer. Often you'll find instrument inputs on audio interfaces, it accomplishes that same goal. You plug in an instrument and you press the instrument button, and now that input that maybe was a low impedance input acts as a high impedance input that's compatible and optimal for that high impedance source. Okay, so that's the first thing. But in live sound in particular, and in situations where like I'm here upstairs in my control room and I record instruments that are downstairs in my basement, that's a long distance. So I wouldn't want to take an instrument cable from a guitar downstairs and run it all the way up here to my audio interface. That would be a lot of, what's the word? I think capacitance is the term. I have a whole video on that you can find by searching probably Audio University guitar cable. I think you'll find that. Eric Valentine made this really cool cable that you can actually change I think it's the capacitance, and then that you can hear that changing the tone. So typically, the longer you run a unbalanced cable that's a high impedance circuit, no less, the more of a frequency roll off you'll have in the highs. Okay, so you'll start to lose clarity and articulation. If you use a DI box instead, you could plug the instrument cable, maybe a 10-foot instrument cable from the instrument into the DI box, and then there's an XLR output that could go that longer distance, say from the stage to the mixer or from downstairs to upstairs, and that's a balanced connection. So a DI box does more than two things, but two basic things. It bridges the impedance, it matches the impedance between the input and the output. And when I say match, I actually mean that it provides an optimal impedance structure for connecting high impedance sources to low impedance inputs. And then it also creates a balanced connection that can go over 1,000 feet if you needed it to. So yeah, that's really important. If you ran an instrument cable like this for even 100 feet, it would not only sound very muffled, but it would also sound very noisy, because that's an unbalanced connection and it doesn't reject noise in the same way that a balanced connection like XLR or balanced TRS could. And just to answer the common question, no, you couldn't use a balanced TRS cable straight from your guitar to the instrument input of your interface, because your guitar is not designed to work with a balanced circuit. Okay, so I hope that answered your question. But if you want to see one of my videos, I put together a full video. Just search Audio University impedance, and I think that video will be really good for you. I'm actually going to be working on more videos in the near future with Radial to talk more about DI boxes and transformers and all of those things that, we use them. And once you figure out, if I'm connecting an instrument to a mic input, I want to use a DI box. That's all you really need to know. But for those who want to learn more about how they work, I'm going to be talking about that pretty soon. All right. Looking for another question here. All right, let's read this one. It says, I'm relatively new and trying to budget for expansion. You got an RME AOXD Dante card. Let me look what that is really quickly. Okay, so that's just a PCIe card that goes into a computer and allows you to connect it to a Dante network. You're wondering if UAD E1X preamps and other brand preamps are interoperable. So let me look that up really quickly. UAD E1X. Okay, so that is a preamp that can be connected, I believe, to a Dante network. Is that true? Yes, okay. Yes, so the answer to your question is, on a Dante network, are these different tools from different companies interoperable? Yes, they are, and that's one of the best things about Dante. Now, there are different protocols. So if you had something that's like a AVB device, you wouldn't be able to just put it on a Dante network and it work. But companies that have Dante cards in their gear have a license to use Dante cards. And when you put that on a network with other Dante devices, you'll be able to send audio to and from them. So that's a really good question. One of the best things about Dante is that it does allow for multiple brands to be interoperable. Now you say phantom power, et cetera, and controls. I was speaking more so you're going to be able to get signal from one place to the other. Whether or not you're able to use phantom power, like engage phantom power on the UAD preamp from your RME total mix? Probably not. In fact, I'm almost certain not. However, and that's also the case with like your preamp gain. You'll probably need to use some sort of control app for the device you're trying to control. That's one limitation. Now in Dante controller, maybe you could, because I do know that there are some devices, like I've got a Yamaha DM3 here. It's a console, and if I connect that to a Yamaha Dante stage box, I would be able to control the preamp. But I've never been in a situation where I've connected, like I have a RME 12 mic Dante downstairs, and if I connect that to this mixer, I can get signal in, but if I want to adjust the preamp, I need to use the knob on the preamp downstairs. Yeah, so I think that's more so your question. Will you be able? Is control interoperable? I'm pretty sure it's not. But signal wise, yes, you can route audio from any Dante device to any other Dante device. All right, looking for another question here. These are really good. Thank you for showing up and asking your questions. Okay, here's a question. How do you learn audio theory aside from YouTube, especially when trying to learn the harder theory? And I guess by harder theory, you mean the things that like electronics and acoustics and the hard science behind audio stuff. I try to share that in my videos in a approachable way, but you're right. Like in a 8 to 15-minute video, it's really difficult for me to give you the depth of explanation that you could get in a 500-page book, or a 40-page chapter of that book that's on a particular subject. So I would say books are a really good way to go. One that's particularly useful, well renowned, and also it's broad. It talks about acoustics. It talks about electronics and grounding and all these things. Is Sound Engineer's Handbook. It's written by several authors, but the author is Glenn Ballou, and it's basically an expert on each of these topics writes a chapter, and I think the editor is Glenn Ballou, and he writes a chapter, if not a few, inside there. So look that up. The Sound Engineer's Handbook. I think that's what it's called. Let me make sure. Sound. Oh, sorry. It's called Handbook for Sound Engineers. It looks like this. There are different. This is the one I have right up here, but it looks like there are different covers. This is a really good book for the technical stuff. I would highly recommend it. And otherwise, I think it depends on what you want to do. That stuff is useful no matter what you want to do, whether you want to do recording or whether you want to design gear. If you want to just get better at audio, I know you probably know this already, but I just want to say it. Make sure you're also practicing, because it's not all about theory. I do think the theory helps, and the theory can come from YouTube videos, it can come from books, it can come from courses, it can come from like mentorship, whether you have somebody in person or our members have access to me and to Gabe, and we can answer questions for them as they're trying to learn these things. So that's a way to learn the theory. But then the practice, we always, with our members especially, try to suggest that they actually apply what they're learning, and what they're studying needs to be applied to something for it to actually what's the word, assimilate, or to actually be useful for them, become a part of their skill set. So I know that if you're at this level, you're probably doing both, but I just want to say it for everybody out there. Like, make sure you're actually practicing and putting this stuff into practice. Whether you are designing speakers, like maybe build a speaker cabinet, or if you're a more typical audio university viewer, if you're like recording and producing music, make sure you're not just reading about it or watching videos. Make sure you're actually opening up a DAW, plugging in a microphone and recording stuff and mixing it. Okay. Let's go to the next question here. Okay. It says, my laptop has 2 inbuilt microphones. If I record stereo and convert it to mono in Audacity, it cancels my voice at the start and end of my voice. Is it because wrong wiring hardware inside? Um, I'm not really sure. It could be a lot of things. The thing about laptop speakers and microphones is that they know they're going to be used in noisy environments, and so they have a lot going on under the hood that we don't really know about in terms of like DSP, digital signal processing. For a voice, though, I would always recommend just using one. So maybe in Audacity, if it records a stereo file with a left and a right, maybe just break that into 2 files so that you can just use one of them. I appreciate your resourcefulness using the microphones that are built into your laptop. Of course, if you use a microphone that you can get closer to you, that is designed for recording voice, that's going to give you better results. But hey, you got to work with what you have, and I think you're onto something here. Um, it's probably some sort of phase cancellation and some sort of DSP that's going on. Again, what I'd recommend is if you search Audio University, like missing right channel, or like Audio University only hear one channel, you'll find a video I made that will tell you how to break apart a stereo file in Audacity into 2 mono files. And then you can just pick which one sounds better and ditch the other one. However, if it's summing it to mono, actually, I'm sorry, you said that in here. It says if I record stereo and convert it to mono. Yeah, when you do that, there are often different options. Like, do you want to take both and sum them to mono? You don't want to do that. You want to take both and split them so that the left is still just the left and the right still just the right, and you delete one of them. Because if you mix them, they might interact, because those mics, one might be here and one might be here. And like I was saying with the binaural stuff, that can be helpful sometimes. That's why stereo mic setups exist. But if you're combining those into mono, it's just not ideal, especially if you have the option to just use one of them, because voice is inherently a mono instrument, and you're probably going to want to treat it as a mono instrument and make it stereo through reverb plugins in Audacity and other things within your computer in a more controlled environment. What is the best software for live mixing? I would say live mixing is definitely best on a console. If you have a console, like I have the Yamaha DM3 here, that's a physical console. It's got faders, it's got knobs. Every channel has its own EQ and compressor. Now, if you can't afford that, there are some options that are less expensive, and they have the same engine running, but they don't have the physical control surface. So you could control them with like a computer or with a tablet. Something like the, what's it called? Behringer XR18, I think. Yeah, I think that is what it's called. So this is something that I might recommend if you're doing live mixing, especially if you're doing like an actual band, okay? And then I'll give you some other options after this. Come on, show me a picture. All right. Oh, here we go. So this is just a rack mount device. It's got 16 microphone preamps. It's got 6 line outs and 2 additional main outs. So 8 total line outs. And you would then be able to wirelessly or through a network connection control that as if you're controlling the mixer. And let's see if it shows the actual interface. Nah, it's not going to. Let's see if we can do images. Here we go. So kind of something like this. So then on a tablet, you'd be able to manage all of those controls. So that'd be a console or something like this would be my number one recommendation. Now you could also theoretically mix with something like Total Mix. Like if you had an interface that has a mixer built in, this is what you guys hear, right? I can I can add some other stuff. I can give you some whatever noise is on this input and you'd hear it. Or if I had, software playing back here, I could put it in there, and I could create a mix to you guys, and then I could make another mix to this destination and another mix to this destination. So this is something you could use, but I'll tell you that even the Behringer, it's going to be cheaper than probably my interface, uh, and because it's designed for that sort of thing. It's designed for live mixing. Another option could be to just use a regular interface and run it through a DAW, and then use something like loopback plugin, or like some sort of plugin that would allow you to route your output of your DAW into the input of your streaming software. Now I'm starting to think though, like, are you mixing for a live stream or are you mixing for speakers in a room? If you're mixing for speakers in a room, I'm telling you, I would highly recommend something like the Behringer or a physical console. It's going to be extremely low latency. That means there's not going to be a weird delay between when an instrument is struck and it comes out of the speakers. It'll be really, really short. Whereas if you use a DAW, the more processing you need to do in the DAW, the longer you'll need to make your buffer size. And I've got stuff on all this. If you search Audio University Loopback, that'll help you understand how these different options could work. I've got if you search Audio University Live Stream Mix, that could be a helpful video for you. You could also search Audio University latency to even figure out what latency is, because the problem you might run into if you're in a live room where there are musicians who are going to hear the sound coming out of those speakers, that latency could be a big problem for them. Because it's kind of like when you talk on a Zoom call and you hear yourself with an echo, it's hard to focus and it's hard to play an instrument when you hear yourself at a delay. But if you're doing a live stream, they won't actually hear the delayed sound, because the delayed sound is going to be on somebody's phone across the world. So in that case, you could potentially run all of their instruments into an interface and then run that through a DAW session and just use Loopback or some other tool to get that audio out of your DAW into their live stream. And in that way, you could use something even just like Reaper, that you can, I think the full license is like $60 or $70. So that would be my last recommendation. There are benefits to using a console though. And I think, like I said before, it's essential you use a console or something that's made for live sound if you're going to be in an environment where the playback is in the same room as the musicians. Okay. Otherwise that delay could be a big problem. Why does actually applying EQ feel so hard, though? I don't know if that's a question for me or if that's a part of a conversation going on here, but I feel you. One thing you might try is the ear training lab that we have. We have a free version and we have a full course that's 15 weeks long, and it walks you from complete beginner, or even if you are an experienced mixing engineer, it would still be helpful, because by the end it gets progressively more difficult, and you'll start to learn how to identify different frequency bands using the vowel method and using some other methods. But you can get started on that whole journey with the free version at audiouniversityonline.com/ear training guide. Um, Let me also show you this QR code. If you just scan that and you sign up, that'll give you access to all of our free resources. And a part of that library is the ear training guide and the ear training lab. So maybe just scan that QR code and then click the link that I email to you and find the ear training guide within that library. And that's a really good place to start. That'll allow you to not just be guessing. And for me, that was a huge thing. Like I went from completely lost, just like if I heard something was wrong, I just boosted a frequency and started sweeping, and that's helpful. But really, if you boost any frequency by 12 dB, it's going to sound bad. It was a lot better when I started doing this ear training method that I offer in the membership now. When I started doing that in college, it allowed me to hear a frequency imbalance and know generally where it was. So if I heard I knew it was kind of in the 200 to 250 hertz range. If I heard and harshness, I knew that it was in the 4 kilohertz range. And you'll learn just the same in the first few weeks if you go take that course. All right, looking for another question here. I'm still here. Sorry for the dead air, but trying to do this solo. I appreciate you guys spending time with me. Please, if you have questions, leave 3 question marks before. That would be really helpful. Okay, here's a question. It says, just getting started exploring the mixing and recording process. In regards to practice, do you have suggestions for how to get tracks to work with as practice? The free resource library has some links to free downloadable sessions that are recorded well, that you can put into any DAW and start mixing. So that would be one thing I'd try. But I'm telling you, the more and more I study this, because I'm a student myself, the more and more I study this, the more I realize that you want to practice mixing, but it's actually the better you become at earlier things in the process, the better your mixes are going to sound. Okay. So for example, if you're spending a lot of time trying to make a guitar not sound muddy with EQ and with other tools in the mix, you would have been much better off probably like moving that microphone and making it not sound muddy just by microphone placement or by microphone selection. And then you would have a lot better time getting microphone placement right if you just adjusted the amp settings and made it sound good. Or, on a drum kit, if you're having a really hard time making it sound good in a DAW, if you move your mics, that could improve things. And then like a video I'm working on right now about drum tuning. My friend Ernesto is a drum tuning expert. He is a backline tech where he sets up instruments for festivals and for concerts and things like that. And he's also been a drummer for his whole life. I gave him some mics that I didn't need, and they're pretty cheap mics, compared to the stuff I've got downstairs. They're a fraction of the cost. But when I went over to his house and I listened to those mics on his drum kit, it sounded way better than what I have here with all this expensive gear in an untuned drum kit. So these are things that I would recommend. Like if I would have just tuned the drum kit, it would have made everything downstream so much easier. You can even go earlier than that, like if the keyboard and the guitar are clashing, yeah, you could try changing the tonality of those instruments, but you could also just try altering the composition and the arrangement. The song itself, if you have a great song with a great arrangement, making that stuff sound good in the recording and getting it to fit together in a mix, it's going to be so much easier. So I know that's like maybe not what you're doing. Maybe you're taking instrument or recordings from other people and mixing them. That's what you want to do. In that case, check out the free resource library, download, you'll just go in there and you'll find the download multi-tracks button in the library, and you can download hundreds of tracks. But if you're like a music producer, if you're like me and you want to be a songwriter who writes the song, arranges the song, records the song, mixes the song, I would recommend starting as early in the process as possible and just doing that again and again. So you write the song and your songs will get better every one you write. And then you arrange the song and you produce and you sort of experiment with moving, the keyboard part down and playing the guitar a little higher to separate the registers they're playing in. And then you try moving the mic on the guitar amp and all these things. You just do those things and you're going to get better. Something that in the Ask a Professor session that we did last month with Gabe Herman, he was saying that you actually you learn how to record by mixing your missteps in recording. So if you record something and then go to mix it, yeah, you need to now fix it in the mix. But at least now you know that next time you want that sound, you'll do the recording a little bit differently. And then you can do the same thing where if you're in the mix and you you wrote a song in a certain way that's making it difficult for you now, next time you're writing a song, think about that and write differently. And if you're in the mastering phase and you hear something that could have been better in the mix, well, now you're a better mix engineer because you understand the problems that your mix can cause in the next step, the mastering phase, right? So I think that it's important if you want to be a turnkey solution for somebody, or if you just want to make your own music like me, then do it a lot, from the beginning to the end. And each step you're going to be advising your skill set on how to do better next time. Um, if you do want to start with those multi-tracks, listen for what problems you're running into. What do you have to chisel out with EQ? And then go record that instrument at your house and say, like, how can I move the mic to accomplish a similar goal? If I pull the microphone away from something, the proximity effect is a tool I can use. The closer it is, the more bassy it is. The further it is, the less bassy it is. That could be a better alternative than having to use EQ to remove bass after the fact. Right? I hope that makes sense. There are endless lessons that you can learn, but that's just one of them. And I hope that gives you an idea of how to practice. Okay. So the next question we're going to find here. Sorry for this phasiness. You hear this? Shh. Yeah, I got this mic. I need to adjust it a little bit. Maybe that'll help. All right. Or I just need to stay still. There we go. Yeah, right. I can't do that. Okay, let's look for another question. It says, I added a 3-port FireWire card. Now we're clipping. I added a 3-port FireWire card to my PC to run a dual Fireface 800 setup. What do you think about the bandwidth between FireWire interfaces and USB-C? Oof. I've never actually used FireWire. I've always used USB. And I even, on my interface here, I've got, I think, like 16 channels in, 16 channels out or so, maybe 20 or something. And I use USB 2.0. Like, I think the bandwidth is more than enough. Now, if you're starting to get into more and more channels, then you may start to run into limitations. And I think FireWire is something you're probably going to want to get away from eventually, unless you're like done upgrading your computer and you want to use that computer for the foreseeable future, because FireWire it's kind of been retired. But there are other options. I think USB is probably the safest. There's like Thunderbolt. I don't know. I think USB-C, USB 3.0 to be specific, is going to be enough for what you need to do. It's got a lot of bandwidth. If you're doing, I don't know, does FireWire have? I know that Thunderbolt has some latency advantages over USB-C, even USB 3.0, even, but I don't think that that's that practical, to be honest. Like I have no issues monitoring through my DAW. And if I have to make the buffer size so large that I can no longer monitor through my DAW because of latency, I just monitor through like my interface directly, or I monitor through my console here so I can use some more processing. But I wish I could offer a better advice for you. I just have almost no experience with FireWire. The only thing I know is that you can find USB on every machine you buy today, and you probably couldn't find a machine with FireWire. So I'd start migrating to USB-C or to USB in general if you're at a place where you can do that. Okay. Next question says, I have a synth that I use as a second keyboard at church. It tends to take over my mix. How can I fix that? Should I pan or reduce its range? I guess I'm curious. A synth that I use as a second keyboard. So when it takes over your mix, I wonder if it's just generally too loud, or if it is somehow a patch or an instrument being played on the synth that it's too much in a certain frequency range. If it's just generally too loud, just adjust the level, or um, you can either reduce the level at the output itself, or you can go to the console and reduce the level there. I expect though that you're probably dealing with something where it's like the patch itself is stepping on other instruments. It doesn't fit into the mix as well as your other sounds. So in that case, maybe talk to the sound operator, the front of house engineer, and ask them to carve out some space in whichever frequency range it's not fitting in. Like if it's boomy and it's, oh, actually you just came back and said it's too loud. Yeah, it's easy. Just turn it down, either at the output of the synthesizer or at the input of the console on the other side. But I want to get to that point that I was making. If it is just frequency imbalance that's stepping on other instruments, if somebody else is watching this and having that problem, well, then you just ask, what can I not hear when the synth? What is the synth hiding? And if it's hiding the bass, well, then maybe you start to think, where is it hiding the bass? Is it the low meat of the bass? In that case, maybe we cut out some 100 hertz or 200 hertz or so out of the synth to allow the bass to come through. Is it the articulation of the bass, like the 1 kilohertz, or the even higher frequencies? Well, then maybe we just carve that out of the synth to make more room there. Yeah, if you have more information on how, like you say it's too loud, if it's more complicated than I'm making it sound, let me know and leave another comment, and I'll try to give you some more advice other than, oh, it's too loud, turn it down. I know that sounds kind of simplistic, so I want to give you a good answer if I can. Okay, here's another question. Can irregular stone walls, a piano, and a bookcase act as enough natural diffusion for voiceover? Or is a flat, untreated ceiling still a major issue for low frequency? It's a good question. I think that diffusion is going to be difficult because if you've got irregular stone walls, we're probably talking the depth of the irregularity is probably just like that. And then a stone here and a big, huge differences between the depth of those and the round, some of them, and that could give you some meaningful diffusion if you're a good distance away from that wall. But a flat ceiling is going to cause a spectral reflection, which means basically that the direct sound and the indirect sound are going to be very, very similar to one another. And that's just going to cause like a comb filter. It's kind of similar to what you hear now. If I'm here, what if I tilted my screen up? Hopefully you're hearing like a swirling effect. And that's because the distance between me and the mic compared to the direct sound, the difference between the direct pathway from my mouth to the mic and the indirect pathway, that distance is changing, and therefore the frequency that's being affected is changing. So like flat walls are really hard to deal with. Rather than going for diffusion, I would recommend going for absorption. So if you're doing VO, you're probably using a directional mic. So if you place that directional mic, like right here, it's going to reject sound coming from the back if it's a cardioid. The place where it's most sensitive is in front of it. So maybe put a blanket behind you. Maybe even just put up, I have a video about this if you search Audio University, reduce echo. I think you'll find like 3 ways to reduce echo and reverb in your room. That's a video I'd recommend watching. One of the things I suggest in there is get the mic a little closer. But of course, as a VO artist, that's going to create proximity effect, and you're going to get a boomier sound. Just like if I get a lot closer here, not only does my voice get louder, but it also gets more boomy. So you may not want that. You may want a little bit more distance from the mic and to the voice. But rather than putting treatment behind it, as people often do, I'd recommend putting treatment behind you, because then the indirect sound that comes back at the mic will be absorbed by that blanket behind you. So that would be my recommendation, is like think more about absorption than diffusion, especially for VO. You say, does a bookcase act as enough natural diffusion? Not really. A bookcase, it can be somewhat diffusive. It's almost certainly not going to be absorptive because the spines of those books are quite reflective. But yeah, diffusion isn't usually my number one. When I walk into a bedroom that wasn't made for sound, I don't often think, oh, I could fix this with diffusion. I think absorption is a much simpler way to go to get the results you're looking for. That said, you don't want an overly dead room. Like in this room, it's pretty dead, and I might even sound a little bit muffled, but it makes for a space that I can do a lot of controlled tests in, and I can record with a microphone out of the frame. And if I want more liveliness in the room, I can take the absorption off. But I don't think my room is even really big enough to get meaningful diffusion to the point where it would completely eliminate the need for absorption. And I bet you're in a similar situation. A diffusion needs space so that the sound can go and then spread out by the time it reflects back to the microphone. And if you're in a small bedroom, you're probably not in a situation like that. Here's the next question. It says, our wireless mics in our church service keep making crackling noises. How do we solve it? Yeah, that's that's a common question. It's a common issue. If you are just rolling on whatever frequencies that the mics have been on for years, it's possible that other things like TV stations or other wireless devices or even like LED lights are now creating interference on that channel. So what you might do is, whether you're using Shure or Sennheiser or whatever, there's probably a way to go in there and say you want to scan for a new frequency, and then you'll turn off all of your transmitters. Like even right here, I can show you. So what I'll do here is I'll turn this on. Oops, I need to hold it longer. So I'm gonna turn this on, and I'm going to pretend that I'm going to try to find a new frequency, which is probably what you need to do. I would guess that there's some interference that's causing dropouts. So I'm going to turn my transmitter off. The transmitter is the microphone, because I don't want this to be broadcasting a frequency or signal on a frequency that this says, oh, no, it can't go there. So I turn off all my transmitters, and then I go here. I have transmitter 1 or transmitter 2. You can't really see it, but I'm going to go to transmitter 1, and I'll say frequency setup. I'll say initialize my system, and it's discovering, and then I'll say start scan. And now it's just listening to the electromagnetic environment that I'm in. It's listening for TV stations or other wireless devices or LED lights. And it's going to say, okay, in group 3, which is a set of channels, there's group 1, group 2, group 3, etc. Those are channels that are compatible with one another. It says in group 3, there are 35 frequencies available. I could even go to group 4. It says there's only 1 frequency available. Group 5, there are 6 frequencies available. So I'm going to go to group 3. There are 35 available, and I'll say assign. And now what happens is it assigns that frequency to these 2 channels of receiver. And now I just say sync on channel 1. I turn on my transmitter, hold it up here. This Shure device has an IR sync that has an IR light that can just automatically send this or send the frequency to this microphone. And now this is coming in on channel 1, and I could grab my other one and sync it to channel 2. And now I know that I'm on a frequency that, at least when I did that scan, was empty. If you're doing shows each Sunday, I don't want you to mess everything up, if you don't really know what you're doing, but if I were going in there, I would go every Sunday. I would turn off all the transmitters. I would do a scan on the first receiver and then sync a transmitter. Leave the transmitter on, so then I could do a scan that will keep that into an account. It'll scan. It'll hear that transmitter channel's already taken, and then you go through. And I would make sure that Sunday morning I did a scan in the context of Sunday morning, because if you do a scan on Sunday morning and then 5 weeks later, the wireless devices around could have changed. And so that's probably why you're getting dropouts, is because you're using a channel that was working before and now there's interference on that channel. So hopefully that helps. I'm actually coming out with a video pretty soon with this SLXD Plus stuff from Shure that will probably be helpful for you. It talks about why this stuff happens and what companies have done to make it better. So definitely keep an eye out for that video. But in the meantime, go through that process. You could even find the model number. On this, I go to this, I see Shure SLXD 4D Plus. I would type that in, and then I'd say how to set up. And probably the user manual will come up, and that'll show you the specific steps you need to take to do that scan like I just did. It says, as a self-learner of audio physics from books and YouTube, let me start this over. Here's the next question. It says, as a self-learner of audio physics from books and YouTube, is a formal institute necessary today? So basically, in a world of books and YouTube, is a formal institute like a university necessary today? Or can a dedicated self-study path lead to a professional level? Yeah, I think that a dedicated self-study path could lead to a professional level. I don't want anyone to be discouraged thinking I have to go to school in order to be professional. But just like a lot of industries, the more people there are who've gone to schools, the more valuable, or the more likely it is that a job will just require that, So um, I would say that you should definitely make sure practice is a big part of what you're doing. And then if you can learn some theory through YouTube and books, that's better. And those things could make you definitely good enough to be a professional. It's really just about what the job you're looking at really wants. Do you want to be a professional recording engineer? Well, then that's mainly freelance, and it's basically just up to the musicians that you have in your network to hire you, and they probably won't require a college degree. Live sound companies, they may or may not require a college degree. AV integration for different like commercial environments, that's where you're starting to get into, okay, a lot of those companies now do require a degree. And so it really just depends on what you're wanting to do. I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. Let me get back to it. We've talked a lot, Gabe and I, as we created our Audio University membership, and we've figured out, we've deduced that you need theory, practice, feedback, and community to really get better at anything. So the theory can come from books and YouTube. The practice comes from you putting that stuff into action. The feedback is you taking what you applied and showing it to someone who knows what they're doing and getting feedback on it. And then the community is like the network I was talking about. You want to know people in the industry so that you can actually learn from them and get opportunities with them. So it's hard. If you do go to school, don't expect that you just go to school and then you've got a job. You really need to apply yourself at the school, because the school is just a institution that facilitates theory, practice, feedback, and community. We're trying to do a similar thing at Audio University for our members. If you're interested, you can find a link below. But that's essentially what a school does. So if you just go there and only take the theory, it's no better than just watching YouTube and only taking the theory. You've got to go learn the theory and then apply it and then get feedback on it. And also in doing that, one of the best things about going to an institution is that the feedback and community are really built in. A lot of, pretty much every opportunity I've had It comes from the people that I've met along the way, including at my university program. So I hope that's a good answer. I don't want to discourage people to make them think, oh, I can't go to a college or a university, so I shouldn't even try. Because I truly believe you can record um, without going to a university. But there are benefits, and I don't want to shortchange that as well. I don't want to discount that overly either. Okay, let's find some other questions. I'll stick around for probably another 15 minutes here. Here's a question. It says, right now I've been practicing at our live church service, but I want to start getting into gigs and volunteering experience because I'm 16 and in other venues, but I'm not sure where to look or who to ask. Uh, Props to you for being so ambitious at 16. That's really cool. I would say that the church service is a really good way to continually get experience, especially if different musicians come in there and you've got to deal with different sounds. But you're probably also dealing with just a system that's installed and it's the same thing every time. So, what I might recommend is if there's a local live sound rental company in your area, maybe see if you can go do an internship there. I started out at a local, I had studied in college, but then my senior year, I went to get an internship because that was a part of the program. And I got an internship at a live sound rental company. And that was really helpful because I was just scanning gear. This microphone's going out to this job. I scan it. I make sure we have all the microphones that are supposed to go, and then when it comes back in, I scan it back in. But that wasn't all I did. There were also audio engineers who had decades of experience that were teaching me a bunch of stuff. And I also got more familiar with different products and different equipment. And then eventually they would allow me to go out and shadow. And then eventually they would allow me to go out and do some jobs. And then they hired me eventually. So I think that doing that's really helpful working for a rental company because first off, you don't have to find your own clients. The opportunities to get hands-on experience will show up on their own. And then also, as opposed to a church where it's just the same system you're using over and over again, a live sound rental company will have several different pieces of gear that will be deployed in several different configurations. So you're learning how to actually set stuff up. That was one thing in college. I didn't really get much experience setting up different types of gear. We had the gear we had, and it was usually already set up in the case of the studio. But then doing live sound, doing that internship at the live sound company allowed me to set up and tear down and set up and tear down and use it for a band and use it for a meeting and use it for a convention and all of these different things. And that really quickly built up my experience. So that's something I'd recommend for you. Again, respect for having that sort of ambition at 16 years old. That's really commendable. All right. Next question. It says, if I have an instrument such as an organ that seems to take over my mix, how should I pan or use range? Um, I was talking to Justin Coletti. You guys might know him from Sonic Scoop, and he's got a really cool methodology about this. He was telling me that he would recommend a new student just have a problem and see what you can fix with just faders, and then see what you can fix with just panning, and then see what you can fix with just EQ, and then see what you can fix with just compression. So I would recommend that because if the organ seems to take over the mix, it may just be a level problem. Maybe you just need to bring the level down. But if that makes it so that you can't hear the articulation, well, then maybe it's not the whole thing that's too loud. You just need to take down the level of the low frequencies. And to do that, you could use an EQ that cuts the low frequencies. And then if it's loud in some places and not loud enough in other places, if you're doing it live, you could use a compressor that would decrease the level of the loudest parts, bringing them more in balance with the lower parts. If you're doing this in a recording, I would recommend using like a clip gain or something rather than a compressor. But I think that you're talking about live sound. Yeah, so it's like there are different ways to do this. And I can't really tell you how because I don't know the mix. So, but you know already, should I pan or use range? I think by range, maybe you mean uh, a EQ. I mean, try it. You know, I think you're onto something. If you could, if it's stepping on the guitar, maybe moving the organ over here and the guitar over here will create the space you need. Or if you do that and they're still stepping on each other, maybe using EQ on one or both of them will make the effect you need. It really is just about experimenting, but I think you're onto something. The fact that you know that the organ seems to take over the mix is actually the hard part. Most people hear music and they can't even tell you what the organ is, and then much less tell you that I think of all these different components, this component, the organ, is the problem. You've already done that, so now your goal is to make the organ fit into the mix better. And to do that, you can either turn its level up or down. You can turn the level of particular frequencies up or down. You can control its level with compression. You can move it with panning, and just use those tools and figure out which combination works best. But I think you're on the right track. Okay, just going through some final questions here. It says in ears or headphones while live mixing. Yeah, it can be useful, particularly if you're mixing in ears. But I think what you're saying is if you're mixing at front of house, do you want to check things with headphones? Definitely PFL to make sure that you're not about to blow up speakers and you're not about to send the wrong signal to the speakers, etc. Like, you know, listen to stuff, audition it in headphones first. But then there's also something to be said about listening to something in solo. And if you're in the middle of a show, you can't really solo something in the PA. So I think headphones are helpful there. And you know, with when you use headphones in a studio, you're doing some of that stuff like diagnosing, but you're also sometimes checking to see if it translates. I think that that's a little bit different in live because you know if it translates. There's one set of speakers it's going to, and it's right there in front of you. So I think that the headphones in live aren't as helpful for does this translate to headphones because no one's listening on headphones except you. But there are cases where you are mixing a live stream at the same time. So then headphones could be really helpful to switch to that mix to get an idea for what it sounds like. The issue is that when you're using headphones in a really loud environment like that, you're probably not actually hearing just what's in the headphones. You're hearing the headphones mixed with what's around you. So headphones are kind of difficult to use for mixing. But they are essential for when you need to hear something that you don't want the audience to hear. All right. Looking for some more questions here before I have to go. This is good. What things, aside from audio and mixing theory, did you learn when going into sound engineering gigs? Like offshore audio, I love that guy, by the way. We met years ago when he was first getting started. He's really come a long way, and he has good videos on his channel. If no one's seen offshore audio, go check him out. Uh, he said to learn things like networking and IP troubleshooting. I think that's a great suggestion. Um, Definitely learn how IP networks generally work. You don't need to be an expert, but you should know what an IP address is, what a subnet mask is, and general terms. You can learn a lot of that through like the free Dante training. So that's something I'd recommend. Like go take the Dante level 1, maybe even the level 2 training on the Dante website. That'll teach you not only about Dante, which is an audio specific protocol, but also it'll teach you about networking in general. The Dante training does a good job of that. I think acoustics are also really interesting. So learning about how sound can interfere with other sounds is helpful. I've got a lot of videos on that. Anytime I talk about acoustic treatment, I try to teach those principles because I think that's what's most important, understanding the principles underneath it. You might even search Audio University comb filtering, and that'll lead you to a pretty good video to get you started in understanding how phase relationships work. And you say aside from audio and mixing theory, I want to make sure that you're including recording and microphone placement in that. And if your goal is to do live sound, learning about recording and how mic placement impacts the sound is also useful for live sound. Even if you're not recording in live sound, getting the mic placement right is even more important, because it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to run up there and change it once the show has started. So understanding how mic placement works, understanding how acoustics work and these things, you can learn them in isolation, and then once you go out and apply them in real gigs, then you're going to say, oh, you know what, that principle that I learned could potentially apply here, and you start to pull from these different things. So I hope that's a good answer for you. Okay. Looking for some more questions here. I do need to step away in just a few minutes, but again, I appreciate everybody showing up. There are links in the description to the free resource library and also to the membership if you're interested in joining. Um, you get access to all of our courses. You get access to me in the membership. I can answer your questions. We also have Gabe Herman, who's a professor. We have some other professors that do some guest courses here and there. And yeah, you've got like a bunch of people who do audio and music production. So it's a cool community. Okay. Do you have suggestions on good online resources regarding recording and mixing and mastering of classical music, choir and ensembles? I mean, hopefully Audio University is that. Um, there are many other channels. I mean, the usual suspects. Produce Like a Pro, Joe Carell. You've got Offshore Audio. You've got Michael Curtis and Sonic Scoop and all of these other channels. I think all of those people are reliable, and you can learn a lot from them. But I think if your question is, will the things I learn about pop apply to classical? Some will and some won't. But I think classical is one of those things where so much of it has to do with just mic placement, that if you search videos on mic placement or um, like microphone polar patterns and things like that, you're going to learn a lot of really good information. And then I would just recommend, like listening to a lot of classical music and understanding how the image usually works. How wide is an orchestra in a typical orchestral recording? And that will help you figure out where to place the mics and what to listen for once you've placed those mics and before you hit record. Yeah. So, not to plug myself, but a good resource, Audio University, I would hope. Here's a good question. What is the purpose of range in gate and compression? So, compression typically wouldn't have a range, but a gate could, and an expander often will. I might be wrong. If I'm thinking of this wrong, somehow a compressor could have a range. Forgive me, but I like to think of it in terms of a gate, because a gate, if the range was infinity, then anytime the sound dropped below the threshold, it would reduce it. It would completely turn that channel off. But then if the range is set to minus 6 dB, then anytime the sound drops below the threshold, it'll only take it down to 6 dB, to minus 6 dB. And then when it goes above the threshold, it'll let it open, and then the gate closes, but it doesn't completely close if the range is set to something like minus 6 dB, minus 12 dB. The gate only closes, so to speak, by reducing it down to as much as 6 dB or as much as 12 dB. If it's at minus infinity as the range, then the gate will completely close, and then it'll open, and then it'll completely close. So range is useful when it's like the gate being completely closed kind of takes the life out of this drum sound and makes it sound really weird. But maybe I don't need to completely I don't need to completely I don't need to completely turn off the signal path. I just want to reduce a little bit unless that instrument is actively playing, and then I want it to come back at full level. If people would like a video on gates, I don't think I've ever done that, so let me know in the comments. It's a good question though. All right. Well, I think, let me answer this one last question. I've already mentioned it though a lot in this stream. It says, outside of university, are there any other trade schools in Northern Connecticut area which you might recommend? I don't know that area very well. I know that Gabe Herman teaches at the University of Hartford, the Hart School in Hartford, Connecticut. So that's a really good program, but that's a university. I don't know of any trade schools because I'm just not from that area. But yeah, I think that in the meantime, learn what you can on YouTube, learn what you can by reading, and learn what you can by practicing. And then just search online and see if you find any good options, because there are benefits to going to a trade school. There are benefits to going to a university, but they are what you make of them. And you can definitely you can gain a lot of ground just on your own if you put it in the work. All right, it says, thanks for your answer. So far, my limited experience is that it's hard to do very much during mixing. Maybe there's some great ideas on how to handle large dynamic ranges in another way than pop. And this is in regards to that question about um, resources for learning about classical music. Yeah, exactly. It is hard to do much. Well, I wouldn't say it's hard to do much during mixing, but typically for a classical recording, you're trying to capture the performance in the room. And so it's less likely that you're going to use extreme processing, because you really want to allow, typically, I don't want to say what you need to do, because who knows, maybe next year classical recording will be a lot more heavy handed. But I just know that in general, classical engineers want to let the performer breathe and let the performer shine through. So it's much more about capturing than it is producing. Let's just say that. So yeah, it's like you can do a lot during mixing, but you just typically don't. And it's best in classical, at least in the classical style of classical recording, to capture the moment and allow be sort of minimalist about it. You know what I mean? And that's why a lot of just spaced pairs, uh, or like a decatree is used. It's capturing everything with maybe some spot mics here and there, but even those, maybe you just bring those up in the mix and you don't use heavy-handed EQ or saturation or something. But I also don't want to discourage anybody from doing anything. If it sounds good, it is good. So we started this uh, live stream with a saying from Barry Hufker, my professor. Tell me an audio thing, and you guys have told me a lot of audio things here in the comments. I appreciate that, and I think it's a nice way to end it by parroting a phrase that Barry told me as well, which is, if it sounds good, it is good. If you let that be your guiding principle, it's going to take you far. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Again, free resource library. Either scan the QR code or check out the free resource link in the description below. Or if you want to become a member, you can also find more information on that in the description below the video. We have an Ask a Professor Ask a Professor Q&A coming up later this month with Gabe Herman. And I'll be here back with office hours next month. So make sure you get your questions. And until then, I'll let you go. Talk to you soon.